one of the most common arguments that you'll see everywhere, Jerry, is homology. And so I took this from a popular article on BioLogos, Theistic Evolutionist Ministry Organization. And their article is titled, "What is the Evidence for Evolution?" And the first one they point to, if I remember correctly, is homology. So they say forms and structures demonstrate the validity of evolution. Jerry, I'll read this and I'd like to get your thoughts. When we examine the bodies of today's animals in detail, so, you can look at bats, you can look at humans, you can look at whales, and you're going to find similarities in form and structure, right? Like, for example, your forelimbs is a popular one they'll look at. We find some remarkable similarities. For example, the skeletons of four-limbed creatures, what scientists call tetrapods, are only slight variations on the same body plan, Jerry. So as you know, they call this descent with modification. There's variations on that same body plan because these creatures split over time, common descent, and these structures, they vary. They modify over time due to mutation, environment, selection, so on and so forth. The bones are longer in some animals, and in others they are fused together, but they are arranged in the same pattern. And so basically their argument comes down to homologous patterns in the biological world. Jerry, are these patterns good evidence for common descent?
Well, they're good evidence, I think, of the fact that certain designs work really well. And we for many years we had a Jeep. We sold it, but we have a Ford dealer right in town, and so we'd bring the Jeep there, and they would fix it. And talking to the mechanics one day, and he said, basically they're all the same. Yeah, there's differences, and there's certain tools you have to work on a Jeep, but by and large, they're all pretty much the same. A car is a car, and if you have a sedan or convertible, there's so many similarities, and therefore the similarities are there because indeed there's certain things that work. And the best example of this, looking at cars again, is where cars used to be so different. The Volkswagen was 30 years ago was very different from so many of the cars that we see today. Well, now they all look pretty much the same. So a friend of mine just bought a new Porsche, and I expected to see something very different. He pulled it out, and it looks like a Ford. I mean, he spent all this money for a Porsche. A Porsche is basically, looks very much like, it costs more, I guess, than a Ford, but it looks very much like a Ford. And of course, the reason is because people find as a whole that the, not the sedan, but what do they call the cars like a Jeep? But basically they find those cars are convenient. You can have room in the back to store things. You can carry the family in the car. And therefore, virtually all cars are designed very similar because of this common demand, and this common need that people have, and common choices that people have. And therefore, you see a lot of common structures because is there a better way of designing it? Could you think of another way of designing dogs as opposed to the way they're designed now? No, you can't. And it's true, there's a lot of similarities, of course. Even the organs, lung is similar in virtually all terrestrial animals. Very similar in virtually all terrestrial animals. Why? Because that design works really well. Designs are very functional. So I would say homology is, I cover that in my second book, homology is a very poor argument for evolution, because homology is there because of structural limits and advantages. And you find the same thing is true in cars. Instead of the cars becoming more different, as you would expect, the cars are becoming more similar. And therefore, this, my friend's Porsche, looks pretty much like my Jeep. And my Ford we have now looks pretty much like the Jeep. The design is very similar. There are differences, but by and large, it's pretty much the same. The same basic design is there. And that's why if you know how to work on one car, generally you can work on many other cars. And I noticed in the Ford dealer, they have many cars they work on because they're pretty much all the same. Doesn't always work that way, but by and large, you have a similar design because of similar requirements. So thus in tetrapods, you have a very similar design because you have similar requirements. And therefore, you're going to find the similarity throughout the animal world. But yet, on the other hand, you sure see a lot of differences. Differences that you have to wonder, is there, like penguins are so different from dogs. And so there are animals that have major differences, but of course, a penguin lives in a different environment than a dog does. And therefore, animals that live in a terrestrial environment, breathe air, you're going to find a lot of similarities. And that may be one reason why when you transplant organs, we find a number like the valves in a pig are transplanted in humans because, well, heart in pig is pretty much the same as in humans. And for several reasons, the heart in a pig is more advantageous to use in a human than hearts from other animals. But nonetheless, you see a huge amount of similarity. That's why when I taught anatomy, the college, we didn't have cadavers, and therefore we dissected other animals because, again, there are differences, but basically the design of all terrestrial air-breathing animals is pretty much the same.
That's right. You could take automobiles built in North America, Asia, and in Europe, and you're going to find all kinds of similarities. You're going to find homologous patterns. That doesn't mean that they all share a common ancestor in the Arctic somewhere. No, it's good design. Jerry, I think you nailed it. I like to say the Bible is clear. We as humans are made in the image of God, and therefore there must be something about us that reflects the divine. And so perhaps we can get an idea or a sense into how God designed the biological world, Jerry, based on the way we as human engineers design things. And it just so turns out that we design in homologous patterns. God designed the world in homologous patterns. We even design in nested hierarchical patterns, where sedans look a lot more similar to a hatchback than they do to a boat or an airplane. So you have these natural hierarchies that are reflective of design and not descent.
Yeah. To me, they're scraping the bottom of the barrel when they try to use homology to prove evolution.
Their follow-up, Jerry, is typically this. Well, Jerry, cars don't reproduce. Biological organisms do, and so it's a false analogy. What's a good response to that?
Well, that's true. Animals do reproduce, and we see a lot of similarity. But on the other hand, we see a lot of, like penguins. Penguins are just so different from any other animal. How about ostriches? They're so different from any other animal. And so there's a lot of similarity, of course, but there are animals that are so different, evolutionists have a hard time explaining them, like dinosaurs and birds. Huge difference. So yeah, you see similarity, but saying something from a similarity is problematic when you see so many differences. We as creationists look at the differences and say, wait a minute, why would this particular animal be created to be so different from some other animal? I think I like the idea that God created life in such a way so that it does not look like it evolved. So he created life specifically to look like it was created and did not evolve. And that's called the biotic message. And so God is telling us something when we look at life. And if it evolved, I would expect there should be a lot more similarities.
Yes. God made it clear for many reasons, the complexity, the mutually interdependent systems we talked about earlier, that life did not evolve from inadequacy to precision. And so, Jerry, the next argument they'll use, and I like to say when they say, well, cars don't reproduce, I like to say adding reproduction adds more complexity. And so it doesn't help the evolutionists, Jerry. It actually makes the problem worse for them. God is so far ahead of us. He's designed and created his creation, the biological order, with the ability to reproduce and pass on their genes. Imagine we could do that. Imagine car manufacturers could design their automobiles to just replicate. How much money would they save on workers? How much money would they save on production? If we could, we would.
But we're not designed to repair themselves.
Mm-hmm. So the fact that God created us to vary and change and pass on our genes, that speaks to his knowledge, his infinite capability of design. And so the next argument that they use, Jerry, has to do with homology, but now on a DNA level. So we look in the genetic sequences of different species or creatures in the biological world, and we find homologous patterns, just like we do with the morphology and anatomy we're speaking to. But now we see it at, I guess we could call it the blueprint level. What would be a good response?
Well, of course, if you have homology in the morphological level, you'd have to have a lot of homology in the genetic level. And when there's a lot of homology, but I was amazed in discovering the fact that if you have a large area with 45 trees, and you have this murder case I'm thinking about, and a car brushed across one of them, okay, could you prove that this car brushed across this specific tree among hundreds of others, not only in this one area, but in other areas? Well, they found genetic analysis, they can. And so there's been a person convicted of murder because they found he brushed against a part of a plant, and they proved that the plant he brushed against specifically was this plant, which they found in this area. And the other side argued, well, wait a minute, this doesn't prove anything because they're all the same. The DNA of the plants are all the same. They found, no, there isn't. Just like people are all different. You can distinguish everybody in the world by their DNA. Likewise, you can, I assume, at least in this one area, you can distinguish every plant in this area by their DNA. So when you do DNA analysis, you know that this car brushed against this specific plant, which is right here, right near the location of the dead body, period. So this places the car right near the dead body, period. And so that was the main argument they used, which, by the way, the court accepted. And the other side argued that, wait a minute, maybe he just brushed against some other tree over somewhere else, some other park somewhere else. And they proved that he didn't do that. He brushed against this specific tree, which was right near the body, which they found. And that surprised me that the DNA would be that different. I just assumed, I guess, until I watched this show, that the DNA in all trees would be pretty much the same.
Right.
Like people, it's not. And therefore, and they've done this now with dogs, with animals, and so on. And so we know that instead of being identical, we find the DNA of humans, dogs, animals, and so many other, in this case, plants, is different. Why would all the DNA be different among all these plants? I mean, to me, that's the baffling thing, but yet it is different, which is convenient for the forensic analysis because they proved this person was guilty, and they found guilty based on this plant DNA.
I like to say it's the differences that make all the difference. Creationists, we can explain the similarities and the differences. We can explain both homology and homoplasy, where maybe you could speak to this. So anytime there's a discrepancy in the universal phylogenetic tree of life, Jerry, what do evolutionists invoke? Convergent evolution. Well, these are similar traits. We see similarities, let's say in echolocation or the eye system, something like this. But there is no recent ancestry with these creatures. A big one would be a dolphin, ichthyosaur, and a shark, where they have a lot of similarities, streamlined bodies, designed for the ocean environment. But according to the evolutionists, they don't share recent ancestry. So what do they result rather than homology? Or what do they invoke? Homoplasy or convergent evolution. The independent evolution or acquisition of these traits over time. Isn't that just a rescue device? Can you speak to that a little bit, Jerry? Homoplasy and convergent evolution?
Yeah, it is a rescue device. It just reminded me of a quizzes given to children. And the quiz was they had a triangle, and they wanted the students to calculate the hypothesis. If I pronounce it right. It's been a long time since I taught geometry, but the longest line, and there's an X there.
And Jerry, I just wanted to jump in real quick. Feel free to take your time on this one. I just have to fill up my water real quick.
Oh, okay. But the question was, calculate X. So he basically, instead of calculating the hypotenuse of the triangle, he calculated the value of X, which was not hypotenuse, what the teacher wanted, but he circled the X and then said that this is the value. And he didn't calculate the numbers, which is what the teacher wanted. And there are so many of these examples. And so it illustrates, I think, quite well the fact that if you, in this case, the point was if the student doesn't know the answer, he can come up with an answer, which I should have saved some of these. They're really cute, but illustrates quite effectively. You can answer it and it seems right, but it's not what the teacher wanted. And same thing is true in the whole evolution issue. You can come up with an answer which sounds right, but it's not right. And you see that so often. And yes, I should have copied some of these off. They're really cute. And how these kids answer the question. And so it's a good example of the fact that you you come up with reasons. I taught forensics for a while, and it's amazing how people can come up with reasons which they think will explain the problem, and it doesn't in the long run. But in many get something in my throat here. But in many ways, what they're doing is they're coming up with reasons which on the surface appear valid, but which in fact are not at all. And not valid at all. And it's a rescue device, as you mentioned. And it explains it, but it doesn't really prove it.
Yeah. And it's imagination. Evolutionists hope, dream, and imagine that the sophisticated eye system could evolve 30, 40, 50 times. The sophisticated echolocation system of creatures like dolphins, whales, bats could evolve independently several times. It really is science fiction. And the pervasive pattern of homoplasy it undermines their whole argument from homology, because the homology on its own, for the evolutionists to invoke, or for the evolutionists to say, well, this is only evidence for common descent, that's affirming the consequent. Well, perhaps there's another explanation, evolutionists. How about common design? If I walked outside and my grass was wet, I could conclude it's because it rained out. Well, maybe there's another reason. Maybe somebody had their sprinkler on. So I think they're guilty of a logical fallacy on that one, and many of their other points, Jerry.
Yeah, I think I covered that in my second book, but yeah, that's always been a problem for evolutionists, and they just say, well, co-evolutionists, or this explanation they come up with are really problematic.
And I like to say to their assertions, prove it. They're going to say, well, the sophisticated eye system, the camera eye, must have evolved independently many times. And that's due to convergent evolution. But that's assuming evolution to prove evolution. And they're just making that assertion without any real evidence. And so I like your point. Yeah, the blueprint has to share similarities if the structure and the form also has similarities. You're probably going to find many similarities in the blueprint of various modes of transportation designed by GM. Isn't that right, Jerry?
Yeah, like why are all tires round?
Yeah.
Every tire I've ever seen is round.
Yeah.
The only design that works. And so many designs in cars and people are that way because it works.
One pervasive pattern of homology in the biological world, to me, Jerry, points to the God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible is one God, monotheistic. And so one overall general pattern points to that one God. If there were multiple types of patterns, different DNA blocks, rather than RNA, protein, and DNA for some creatures and not for others, that could mislead us into believing God is polytheistic, multiple gods created creatures. No, one pattern suggests one God, in my opinion.
Yeah, one designer. Yeah.